The squad cars arrived at 3:47 a.m., their red and blue lights painting Marcus Chen's pristine backyard in violent strokes of color. Through his bedroom window, he watched 6 officers surround his pool while a woman in a designer robe pointed accusingly at the water where his daughter had been learning to swim just hours before. "That's the one who's been using our pool," she declared, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn that Marcus had spent 3 years perfecting. The lead officer nodded grimly, hand resting on his weapon. Marcus's heart hammered as he realized the Marcus Chen stood at his kitchen window, watching 8-year-old Lily practice her backstroke in the glowing pool water. The underwater lights cast dancing patterns across her delighted face as she moved through the water with the unsteady grace of childhood determination. "Daddy, look. I can do it without holding my nose," Lily called out, her voice echoing across the quiet suburban evening. "I see you, sweetheart. You're getting so good at this," Marcus replied, his voice warm with pride. He glanced at his watch at 30 p.m. 5 more minutes, then we need to get you ready for bed." This had become their ritual over the past month. Ever since the pool installation was completed, Lily had been obsessed with learning to swim. Marcus couldn't blame her after years of apartment living. Having their own backyard oasis felt like a dream come true. The pool had cost him nearly $60,000, representing 2 years of overtime shifts at the accounting firm and every penny of his savings. But seeing Lily's joy made every sacrifice worthwhile. "Can we swim tomorrow too?" Lily asked, as she climbed out of the pool, water streaming from her bright yellow swimsuit. "Of course we can. It's our pool, isn't it?" Marcus wrapped her in a towel, lifting her up despite her protests that she was getting too big to be carried. "Now, let's get you dried off." As they headed inside, Marcus noticed a figure standing at the property line between his yard and the massive estate next door. Mrs. Wellington, though he'd never actually been introduced to her, stood perfectly still in her silk robe, watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she saw him looking, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of her landscaped garden. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The Wellingtons had lived in the neighborhood for decades, their sprawling mansion a testament to old money and older attitudes. They'd made their disapproval of Marcus's presence known in subtle ways. Since he'd moved in, the Homeowners Association complaints about his mailbox height, the anonymous reports about his excessive lawn watering, the pointed conversations about maintaining neighborhood character that somehow always happened within earshot. He'd tried to be a good neighbor, keeping his property immaculate and his music low. But he'd also refused to be intimidated. This was America, and he'd earned his place here through hard work and determination. No amount of passive-aggressive harassment would make him feel ashamed of his success. After tucking Lily into bed, Marcus settled into his home office to finish some client work. The familiar rhythm of spreadsheets and tax calculations usually relaxed him, but tonight he found himself glancing repeatedly toward the window that faced the Wellington property. Their house loomed against the starlit sky, its Georgian columns and perfectly manicured grounds, a stark contrast to Marcus's more modest but equally well-maintained home. Around 11 p.m., he heard the soft splash of water from outside. Marcus frowned, walking to the window. The pool was empty, its surface disturbed only by the gentle current from the filtration system. He must have imagined it probably just the neighbor's sprinkler system cycling on. He worked until past midnight, finally closing his laptop when his eyes began to blur. As he prepared for bed, Marcus performed his nightly ritual, checking on Lily, ensuring the doors were locked, and taking one last look at the pool to make sure the cover was secure and the chemicals were balanced properly. The pool was his pride and joy, but it was also a significant responsibility. He'd researched extensively before installation, studying safety protocols and maintenance requirements with the same thoroughness he applied to his professional work. The pool glowed serenely in the darkness, its crystal-clear water reflecting the stars above. Marcus smiled, remembering Lily's determination to master the backstroke. Her small face scrunched in concentration as she kicked her legs and windmilled her arms. Tomorrow, he'd work with her on coordinating her breathing. She was so close to getting it right. He was about to turn away when he saw something that made his blood freeze. There, floating near the deep end, was a dark shape that definitely didn't belong. Marcus's heart pounded as he fumbled for the outdoor light switch, flooding the backyard in harsh white illumination. The pool was empty. Whatever he'd seen, if he'd seen anything, all was gone. Marcus stepped outside, his bare feet cold. Against the concrete pool deck, the night air was still and quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the pool pump and the soft whisper of wind through the oak trees that bordered his property. He walked slowly around the pool's perimeter, scanning the water for any sign of disturbance. Nothing. He was about to convince himself that exhaustion had played tricks on his eyes when he noticed something else: wet footprints leading from the pool deck toward the Wellington property. The prints were large, definitely made by an adult, and they hadn't been there an hour ago when he'd last checked the pool. Marcus's mouth went dry. Someone had been in his pool. Someone had been in his backyard, in his space, using his property. Without permission, the violation felt almost physical, a cold knot of anger and fear twisting in his stomach. He pulled out his phone and considered calling the police. But what would he tell them? That he'd seen a shadow in his pool and found some wet footprints. That his wealthy neighbors had been giving him hostile looks. It sounded paranoid even. To himself, instead, Marcus made a mental note to install security cameras as soon as possible. He'd been meaning to upgrade his home security system anyway, and this incident, whatever, it was provided the perfect justification. He took several photos of the wet footprints with his phone, though he wasn't sure what good they would do. As he headed back inside, Marcus caught sight of a light in the Wellington house's single window, glowing yellow in the darkness. He couldn't make out any figures, but something about that solitary light made his skin crawl. It felt like an eye, watching and waiting. The next morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for another swimming lesson with Lily. Had pushed the previous night's incident to the back of his mind, focusing instead on his daughter's excitement as she wolfed down her cereal and chattered about her plans to swim all the way across the pool, without stopping. "Can we practice diving too?" Lily asked, bouncing in her chair. "Jenny at school says diving is the hardest part, but I bet I can learn it." "We'll see," Marcus said, ruffling her hair. "Let's master swimming first, then we'll work on diving. Safety first, remember? Safety first," Lily repeated dutifully, though her eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that made Marcus's heart simultaneously soar and worry. They spent the morning in the pool, Marcus guiding Lily through her strokes while she squealed with delight and determination. She was getting stronger and more confident every day, her small body cutting through the water with increasing grace. Marcus found himself thinking about swimming lessons, maybe even a swim team when she got older. The possibilities seemed endless. It was just after lunch when the doorbell rang. Marcus was in the kitchen preparing sandwiches for their afternoon snack, while Lily played quietly in her room. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door, expecting to see a delivery driver or perhaps one of the friendly neighbors from down the street. Instead, he found two police officers standing on his porch. The older one, a heavy-set man with graying hair and tired eyes, held a small notebook. His partner was younger, with a kind of alert posture that suggested either eagerness or nervousness. "Mr. Chen," the older officer said, "I'm Officer Rodriguez, and this is Officer Kim. We've received a complaint about unauthorized use of a swimming pool. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Marcus's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course, officers. What can I help you with? We understand you've been using a pool that doesn't belong to you." Officer Rodriguez continued, his tone professional but firm. "The homeowner has reported multiple incidents of trespassing and property damage." For a moment, Marcus was too stunned to speak. Then the absurdity of the situation hit him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. The pool, in my backyard, belongs to me. I had it installed 3 months ago." Officer Kim stepped forward, consulting his own notebook. "Sir, we have a sworn statement from Mrs. Eleanor Wellington indicating that you and your daughter have been using her pool without permission. She's provided photographs and witness testimony." Mrs. Wellington, Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "Officers, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. That's my pool. I have all the permits, the installation records, the receipts. Sir, we're going to need to see some identification and proof of ownership, Officer Rodriguez." The fluorescent lights in interview room 3 cast harsh shadows across Detective Maria Santos's weathered face as she spread a collection of photographs across the metal table. Marcus sat rigidly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to stop them from shaking, The room smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, a combination that made his stomach churn. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you," Detective Santos said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the force. "We have a serious situation here. Mrs. Wellington has provided compelling evidence that you've been trespassing on her property and using her pool without permission." Marcus leaned forward, studying the photographs, his breath caught in his throat. The images showed his pool unmistakably his pool butt. The angle made it appear as if it was positioned on the Wellington property. The photos were skillfully taken, creating an optical illusion that would fool anyone unfamiliar with the actual property lines. "Detective, these photos are misleading," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "The angle makes it look like the pool is on their property, but it's clearly on mine. I have the property survey, the permits. Yes, we've reviewed your documents," Detective Santos interrupted, sliding another photograph across the table. "But Mrs. Wellington has provided her own documentation, including this." Marcus stared at the image in disbelief. It was a property survey, apparently official, showing the pool clearly within the Wellington property boundaries. But it was impossible. He'd seen his own survey dozens of times, had walked the property lines with the contractor before installation. "This is fake," Marcus said, his voice rising. "This has to be fake." "Detective, I installed that pool 3 months ago. I have receipts, permits, inspection records." "Mr. Chen, I need you to calm down," Detective Santos said firmly. "Getting agitated isn't going to help your case. Now, Mrs. Wellington has also provided witness statements from several neighbors who confirm seeing you and your daughter using the pool on multiple occasions." She slid a stack of papers across the table. Marcus recognized several names: the Hendersons from 2 houses down, the Thompsons from across the street, even the Garcias who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac. All of them had signed sworn statements claiming they'd witnessed Marcus trespassing on the Wellington property. "This is insane," Marcus whispered, scanning the documents. "These people barely know me. We've exchanged maybe a dozen words in the entire time I've lived here." "That's exactly the point, Mr. Chen," Detective Santos replied. "They're neutral witnesses with no reason to lie. According to their statements, you've been using the pool regularly, despite Mrs. Wellington's repeated requests that you stop." "What repeated requests? She's never spoken to me about this. She's never spoken to me about anything." Marcus's voice cracked with frustration and disbelief. Detective Santos opened another folder, revealing a series of printed emails. "Mrs. Wellington has provided documentation of multiple attempts to contact you about this issue. Email correspondence, certified letters, even a record of a phone call to your home number." Marcus grabbed the papers with trembling hands. The emails were addressed to his email account, the letters supposedly delivered to his home address, all politely but firmly asking him to stop using the pool. But he'd never received any of them. He'd never seen these communications before in his life. "I never got these," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Detective, I swear to you, I never received any of these messages. If someone had told me I was using their pool, I would have stopped immediately. I would have been mortified." "Mr. Chen, we have delivery confirmations for the certified letters. Email, read receipts, phone records showing a 15-minute conversation between Mrs. Wellington and your home number." Detective Santos's tone was professional but skeptical. "Are you telling me that none of this happened?" Marcus felt like he was drowning. The room seemed to spin around him as he tried to process what was happening. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception, creating false evidence and forged documents with the specific intent of destroying his life. But why? And how was it possible that they'd been so thorough? "I want to call my lawyer," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "You're right," Detective Santos replied. "But before you do, I want you to understand the seriousness of this situation. We're looking at potential charges of criminal trespassing, property damage, and theft of services. Mrs. Wellington is also considering a civil suit for damages and emotional distress." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Criminal charges, civil suit, damages. His carefully constructed life was crumbling around him, and he couldn't even understand why. "Detective, please," Marcus said, leaning forward desperately. "Just come look at the property. You'll see that the pool is clearly on my land. The property lines are obvious. The positioning makes it impossible for it to be on their property. 10 minutes of actual investigation will clear this up. Detective Santos studied Marcus's face for a long moment, as if trying to read something in his expression. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Mr. Chen, let's go take a look." The drive back to Maple Heights felt like a journey to another world. Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, watching familiar streets pass by while his mind raced through possibilities. Could there have been a mistake in the original property survey? Could the pool installation company have made a catastrophic error? None of it made sense, but the alternative, a coordinated conspiracy to frame him, seemed even more impossible. As they pulled into his driveway, Marcus noticed that the neighborhood had suddenly become very active. Neighbors stood in their front yards, talking in small groups and watching the police cars with barely concealed interest. Mrs. Wellington was still in her driveway, now accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit who Marcus assumed was her. Attorney Sarah. Marcus called out as they approached the front door. His sister appeared immediately, her face tight with worry. "Marcus, what's going on? The police have been here for hours." "Lily's scared, and no one will tell me anything." "It's going to be okay," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Just keep Lily inside for now." Detective Santos led the way to the backyard, followed by Officers Rodriguez and Kim. Marcus's heart pounded as they approached the pool area. In the bright afternoon sunlight, everything looked exactly as it should. The pool clearly positioned on his property, well within the boundaries marked by the fence line and landscaping. "As you can see," Marcus said, gesturing toward the pool, "it's obviously on my property. The fence line is right there. The property markers are clearly visible." He stopped mid-sentence. Something was wrong. The fence line that had marked the boundary between his property and the Wellington estate was different. The wooden posts that had been painted white were now a different shade, and the positioning seemed off by several feet. Detective Marcus said slowly, his voice filled with dawning horror. "This fence has been moved." Detective Santos examined the fence line carefully, running her hand along the posts. "Mr. Chen, this fence looks like it's been here for years. The wood is weathered, the posts are settled." "No," Marcus said, his voice growing desperate. "This is wrong. The fence was closer to the house, and the posts were painted white. I painted them myself when I moved in." He walked quickly to where the property marker should be, but the small metal stakes that had been driven into the ground were nowhere to be found. In their place were different markers, positioned in a way that would put the pools squarely on Wellington property. "The property markers have been moved too," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "Detective, someone has physically altered the property lines. This is ... This is impossible." Officer Kim knelt down beside one of the markers, examining it carefully. "Sir, these markers look old and established. There's no sign of recent disturbance in the soil." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Not only had someone created false documents and forged evidence, but they'd actually moved physical property markers and rebuilt sections of fencing. The scope of the deception was staggering. The resources required almost unimaginable. "Mr. Chen," Detective Santos said gently, "I can see you're upset. But you need to consider the possibility that there was a mistake in your original understanding of the property lines. It happens more often than you'd think." "No," Marcus whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. I had a professional survey done. I walked the property lines with a contractor. I know where my property ends and theirs begins." He pulled out his phone, frantically searching for the photos he'd taken during the pool installation. But when he found them, his blood ran cold. The images showed the pool installation in progress, but the angles and positioning matched what he was seeing now, not what he remembered. "This is impossible," Marcus said, staring at his phone screen. "These photos aren't right. They've been changed somehow." Detective Santos and the officers exchanged glances. Marcus could see the skepticism in their faces, the growing belief that they were dealing with a man who had convinced himself of a false reality, rather than admit to wrongdoing. "Mr. Chen," Detective Santos said carefully, "I think you need to consider the possibility that your memory of events 2 a.m., surrounded by stacks of documents, photographs, and legal briefs." The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across the evidence that would either vindicate Marcus Chen or destroy him completely. "Found something," she muttered to herself, holding up a magnifying glass to examine a section of the forged property survey. Under intense magnification, she could see the telltale signs of digital manipulations, light inconsistencies in font weight, barely perceptible color variations where text had been altered. Her phone rang, startling her from her concentration. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. "Rebecca, I'm sorry to call so late, but I couldn't sleep." Marcus's voice was strained with exhaustion and stress. "Sarah told me you've been working around the clock on this. Any progress?" "Actually, yes," Rebecca said, unable to suppress the excitement in her voice. "I think I've found the smoking gun. The survey they provided isn't just fake. It's been digitally altered from an original document. My forensic analyst confirmed it this morning." "Thank God," Marcus breathed. "So we can prove it?" "We can prove the document was tampered with," Rebecca said carefully. "But that's just the beginning. I've been digging into the Wellingtons' past legal battles, and Marcus, what I've found is deeply disturbing." She pulled up a file on her computer, scrolling through years of court documents and property records. The Garcias, who used to live at the end of your street, they were forced to sell their home in 2019 after a dispute over an allegedly deck. The Hendersons' same story in 2021, supposedly over a fence violation. In every case, the evidence against these families appeared suddenly and was perfectly documented. Marcus's voice was tight with anger. "How is this possible? How have they gotten away with this for so long? Money, connections, and a system that's designed to favor people like them," Rebecca replied grimly. "But there's something else, Marcus, something that changes everything." She pulled out a manila folder she'd been saving for this moment. "I found the original contractor who installed your pool, a man named David Kim from Precision Pool Installation. He's been in hiding for 3 months, terrified to come forward because someone threatened his family." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "He agreed to meet with me yesterday," Rebecca continued. "Marcus, he has photographs from the installation, GPS coordinates of the work site, and most importantly, he has video footage from his crew's body, cameras showing the entire installation process. The pool was definitely installed on your property, exactly where you said it was." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with barely contained rage. "They moved the property markers after the installation. They rebuilt sections of fencing. They created false documents, all to steal my pool and destroy my life." "It's worse than that," Rebecca said quietly. "David Kim told me something else. The night before your arrest, he saw construction trucks on your street, professional surveying equipment, earth-moving machinery, the works. They didn't just move a few property markers, Marcus, they physically altered the landscape to support their false claims." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "The wet footprints I saw that night someone was in my pool, measuring it, photographing it, preparing for the deception, and the neighbors who provided witness statements," Rebecca continued. "I've been investigating them too. The Hendersons received a substantial loan from Wellington Holdings just days before they signed their statement. The Thompsons had their property taxes mysteriously reduced. The Garcias' mortgage was suddenly paid off by an anonymous benefactor." Marcus felt sick. "They bought testimony. They literally bought witnesses." "There's more," Rebecca said, her voice grim. "I've been tracking financial records, and the Wellingtons have been systematically acquiring properties in your neighborhood for the past 15 years. They don't just want to drive out families like yours, they want to own the entire area." She pulled up a map on her computer showing property ownership throughout Maple Heights. Red dots indicated Wellington-owned properties, and the pattern was unmistakable. They'd been slowly, methodically acquiring every house on the street, using legal intimidation and financial pressure to force out longtime residents. "Your house is the last one," Rebecca said. "The final piece of their puzzle. And Marcus, I think they targeted you specifically because you represent everything they're trying to eliminate from their perfect little enclave." The weight of the revelation settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about racism or classism, it was about greed, about a systematic campaign to gentrify and control an entire neighborhood. He was just the latest casualty in a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "We fight," Rebecca said firmly, "but not the way they expect." "I've been in contact with an investigative journalist at the Herald. She's been tracking similar patterns in other upscale neighborhoods across the city. If we can prove what the Wellingtons have been doing, this becomes bigger than just your case. How do we prove it? David Kim is willing to testify, but only if we can guarantee his safety. The forensic evidence on the documents is solid, but we need more. We need to catch them in the act of fabricating evidence or intimidating witnesses. Rebecca paused, considering her next words carefully. Marcus, what I'm about to suggest is risky, and it could backfire spectacularly. But I think there's a way to force their hand. I'm listening. We're going to make them think you're about to give up. Tomorrow, you're going to call Mrs. Wellington and offer to settle out of court. You're going to tell her you can't afford to fight anymore, that you're willing to admit wrongdoing and transfer ownership of the pool to her in exchange for dropping the charges. Marcus's voice was sharp with disbelief. You want me to surrender? I want you to make them overconfident, Rebecca replied. People like the Wellingtons have massive egos. They'll want to gloat, to celebrate their victory. And when they do, they'll make mistakes. They'll reveal things they shouldn't, maybe even admit to things they've done. And you think they'll confess on a phone call. I think they'll want to meet in person to humiliate you properly, Rebecca said, and when they do, we'll be ready. The next morning, Marcus stood in his kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand. Through the window, he could see his pool, the symbol of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved. In a few hours, he would have to pretend that he was giving up, that he was admitting defeat to people who had systematically destroyed his life. Lily sat at the kitchen table, picking at her cereal. She'd been quiet since his arrest, her usual chatter replaced by a worried watchfulness that broke Marcus's heart. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her father was in trouble, and it was affecting every aspect of her young life. Daddy, are we going to have to move? Lily asked suddenly, her voice small and scared. Marcus knelt down beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Sweetheart, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we stay right here in our home. But even if we have to move, we'll be okay. We'll be together, and that's what matters most. But I like my room, Lily said, tears welling up in her eyes. And I like our pool. I was getting so good at swimming. I know, baby, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm going to fight very hard to keep everything just the way it is. But I need you to be brave for me, okay? Can you do that? Lily nodded, though her lip trembled. I can be brave. Marcus hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. In that moment, he made a silent promise to his daughter and to himself. Whatever it took, however dangerous it became, he would not let these people win. At exactly 10 a.m., Marcus dialed Mrs. Wellington's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. Mrs. Wellington, this is Marcus Chen. I was hoping we could talk. Mr. Chen, she replied, and Marcus could hear the satisfaction in her voice. I was wondering when you'd come. To your senses, I assume you're calling to discuss a resolution to this unfortunate situation. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said, forcing humility into his voice. I realize now that there must have been some confusion about the property lines when I had the pool installed. I can't afford to keep fighting this in court, and I don't want to put my daughter through any more stress. How refreshing, Mrs. Wellington said, her tone dripping with condescension. It's always best when people recognize their mistakes and accept responsibility. I was hoping we could meet in person to discuss the terms, Marcus continued. I want to make this right, and I'd prefer to handle it between neighbors rather than through lawyers. There was a pause, and Marcus could almost hear her considering the offer. Very well, she said finally. Come to my house this afternoon. At 2 p.m., we'll discuss the terms of your surrender. The word surrender hit Marcus like a slap, but he kept his voice steady. Thank you, Mrs. Wellington. I'll see you at 2. As he hung up the phone, Marcus felt a mixture of disgust and determination. And for hours, he would walk into the lion's den and pretend to be a defeated man. But hidden in his jacket pocket would be a tiny recording device, and parked discreetly down the street would be Rebecca Martinez and her investigative journalist contact. The afternoon sun was brute.